Hello. Good, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back from the coffee break. I have a few housekeeping announcements to make before we start with the second session of the conference today. The first one is about the emergency exits in case of fire. Here, they're all signposted. You can see them around the building, around the room here. Then, if you haven't discovered it yet, there's toilets at either side, again, of the lecture hall. So if you go out of those doors, the back doors, and then carry on the corridor, you'll find them on your left-hand side and right-hand side on this. Then after this session, we will have a lunch buffet that will be served in the room just adjacent to this one on the left. So go out of that room, of that door there, and you'll find the lunch area right there. I also have some specific announcements for speakers and invited guests. We will have tomorrow evening, we'll have a cultural tour and gala dinner. If you are invited to this event, you will find an invitation in your delegates pack. So in your conference pack, you will find an invitation slip, which provides some more information about the cultural tour and the gala dinner. In case you've lost your conference pack and you believe you're invited to this, come and see us. We have blue badges. All of the organizers have blue badges. There's also, in the same, still for speakers, in your delegates pack, you will have 2 podcast and video recording forms. So these are just to, if you could just sign them in case you don't mind us recording and then releasing, whether it's a podcast or a video of your lectures. That's very important for us because otherwise, without your consent, we cannot go ahead and release this information afterwards, although we are recording, of course, at the moment. But if you're not happy for it to be released widely, you just don't sign those forms. We will be collecting them from you. So again, if you can sign the podcast and video recording forms, which are in your delegates pack, and then hand them to us with the blue badges, or we'll come and look for you anyways in the next couple of days. I also have a couple of announcements about the program for today. Unfortunately, Dr. Anna Paolini and Giovanni Fontana Antonelli, due to delays in their flights, actually a cancellation of flight yesterday from Paris, are not able to join us this morning. Anna will present via Skype this afternoon at 4:20, and the presentation that was scheduled for 4:20 p.m. by Dr. Hamidreza Jaihani will be shifted to this morning's session. So this morning's session will start with a keynote speech by His Excellency Dr. Ndoro, then followed by presentations by Manuel Fio, Khalila Hassouna, and Hamidreza Jaihani, and chaired by Dr. Zaki Haslan. I think that's all for now, and I will leave you to the second session of the day.
Thank you, Andrea. I think we will start the session with a keynote speech from our Director General, Dr. Weber Ndoro. Then we will be having actually 3 other speakers for this particular session. Manuel Fiol from UNOSAT, and Khalila Hassouna from Econem, and Hamid Reza Jaihani from University of Kashan. So we will be having up to lunchtime, which is around 1 o'clock. So I hope we will be on time. The time now is 11:20. So we are catching up with the time. So we will see how we will do. I hope that our speakers will be respecting the time allocated for their presentations. But first, I'd like to invite our Director General, Dr. Weber Ndoro, to give his keynote speech on the subject.
My apology. They say power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. if I use this one. Okay. As I indicated this morning, I'm not so sure this is a keynote. This is more of my thought processes rather than keynote. As I indicated this morning, I do believe that documentation is key or central to the work we do, particularly in conservation and in managing cultural heritage. And this is something which I will try and emphasize as I go along in my presentation. I would also want to give you a glimpse of what ICCROM is doing, not all the ICCROM programs, but some of the important ones which I think could be relevant to what we are doing. Because we have discussed, and I'm sure we are going to discuss a lot about issues in conflict areas and also technology application, I have tried to shy away from those areas because I think we will have sufficient discussion. But I thought I should start by reminding everyone that whilst conflict is catastrophic and perhaps immediate to us, there are also other disasters or other issues which affect archaeological heritage. And particularly now with climate change, I think we have issues which we should not forget that this affects archaeological sites, perhaps not in this region, but in other regions of the world. We have conditions which we are not used to, and these are affecting archaeological sites everywhere. And at times it's hurricanes, at times it's floods, and archaeological sites, generally speaking, tend to suffer. Particularly, I think we are all aware of the practice of archaeologists. When they excavate, the last thing in their mind is conservation. The first thing is information. They want to get information, and at times they leave these sites open, and that creates a lot of problems. Some other natural disasters, earthquakes, again, probably in the same mold as conflict, we do have impact on this. And of course, there's the natural impact on archaeological sites, which I'm just trying to remind you that these things exist outside the other dramatic issues which we will always look at. But I think it's important to realize that documentation is not just required because the site is in a conflict zone, but that documentation must also take place throughout, even in our general general upkeep of sites, and make sure that we understand what is going on. Of course, there are other issues which affect the way we look at sites. The lack of economic means to look after our heritage, I think it's something which we tend to forget and think that it's easy to do that. I would also say that lack of capacity and skills. Again, this is something which I don't want to say that it is just the experts. It is important that we also make sure that issues like documentation are also done by others who are not experts, particularly when we start talking about conflict areas, and I think I will allude to this later. Urban unrest, in some urban areas, I'm told, they resemble war zones in terms of the impact on archaeological sites. And this is something which we tend to forget because war is dramatic. We tend to rush there and say, okay, heritage is in danger. But in urban environments, the danger is always there. And the danger is always there in the sense of lack of planning. We do not plan for it, and that in itself can lead to disasters. There is also the impact of development. I think of all people we know the Nubian campaign. That was one of the first signals to indicate to us that development is not just something which perhaps improves the lives of communities, but it also destroys archaeological sites. And one of my regrets all the time, and Zaki is talking about Sudan and the work we are going to do in Sudan, one of the things which hit me when I went to Sudan was the number of archaeological artifacts and monuments which we rescued during the 1960s, which is now decaying in storerooms and warehouses, and for us to rescue it in the name of saving heritage and just to dump it and for it to rot somewhere else, I thought that was something which, as archaeologists, as conservators, it should prick our conscience. I'm not so sure whether it wouldn't have been better if it was flooded in some cases. I don't know how many of you have been to Sudan, and if they're open to you, there are museums and all this. You feel, this pain that the world came to the rescue, but at the same time, what did we do after that? And this is the danger with dramatic events where we go in, we document, we try and serve, but then the next thing is once the conflict or the danger is gone, we neglect what we have done. And I think this is something which we need to try and avoid. Of course, a war, we have already been told, is very catastrophic. It leads to destruction. Zaki's presentation indicates that, and I'm just showing you here some of the photographs he has already shown you. But this, again, emphasizes the need for documentation during the conflict, but it would have been better if the documentation was done before. But generally speaking, we don't do that. But as a management issue, I think this is important. Once it's done, once war comes, it's important to document what is happening. It's important to also monitor what is happening. Again, just want to say that documentation is key to our work. For us to understand the processes, whether it's conflict processes, whether it's the natural decay of things as they go by, or just understanding the material conditions, the composition of the material, and how it reacts to different things. Again, it is important for us to document. It is important to document also because it gives us the genesis of the problem. It gives us the indication of what we can do in time. Again, I want to say that there is a lot of documentation which goes on, but unless it is used, I think it's almost pointless in some cases. We need to be able to make sure that it is a continuous documentation process. It is a continuous record rather than something which we do and we forget about it. Of course, monitoring is also a key to documentation. If we can look at different periods and be able to compare, or even with new technologies these days, you can actually be able to see what is documentation. So my point is that we must be able to integrate documentation into into the management processes at all levels. The other issue which I want to emphasize is the issue of broadening the role players of documentation. It is not just the experts, it is also the community. Because what is your archaeological site could also be somebody's grazing land, or as I have called it in the discussion on Great Zimbabwe, it could be somebody's shrine, and you are only looking at it from an archaeological point of view. And yet, you could also get someone to look after it from a different angle, because they respect that place not because of its scientific information, but because of probably religious information. Again, another good example is the city where I'm living now, Rome. The ruins are part and parcel of the townscape, and it is daily lives that you see these ruins everywhere. Unless you involve the population in the conservation and documentation of it, you might actually find that you are fighting a losing battle as a professional because the community doesn't understand what you're trying to do. It is important that documentation also encompasses or it includes the community, and today with technology, I think these things are important and they can be done. Again, I'm just emphasizing here that responsibility for cultural heritage and the management of it belongs in the first place to the cultural community that who have something to do with that cultural heritage. It could be economic, it could be religious, it could be somebody's grazing land, or it could just be a playground for kids. But again, we cannot just privilege archaeological heritage and ignore the other dimensions to that. I'm not going to go into the technologies which we are now familiar with, the mobile phones and how we can document and things like that. The good thing about the mobile phone technology is that it is accessible to almost everybody. Even in a country, in a continent like Africa, you will be amazed by the number of smartphones. How they get it, I don't know. So, but the most important thing is this is a tool for us. We can make these people help us to document heritage. It can help us to get more information on how we can manage the heritage. And again, smartphones, ICCROM has to provide the knowledge, the tools, and the enabling environment to its member states. And that includes providing these in terms of documentation, in terms of management. And of course, ICCROM cannot do that on its own. I think the cheaper it is, the better. ICCROM focuses on three main strategic directions. The first one is focusing on world concerns for cultural heritage, which we need to be able to articulate in terms of the way we work. We also need to create a diverse and inclusive global network. In other words, we need to include all the regions. So far, we have work going on here in the Mana region. I think we are very satisfied as ICCROM is Latin America and Africa. And these can benefit a great deal from the work which you are already doing here to make sure that they also are not left behind in what is happening in the heritage field. And of course, the third one is strengthening, and it also embraces new technologies, it embraces new thinking, and it is in line with similar organizations like the UN and so forth. I've mentioned ICCROM's commitment to ensure that we contribute to the main ones where we can. Of course, we can contribute to all of them, but this might be not the target. So we want SDGs where we can actually contribute. And SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, is something which we have targeted, something which we have said we will look at and try and work around that. It involves also the issues which we are going to be dealing with, conflict and documentation and so forth, and how do we look at that. The other SDG which we have isolated, sustainable tourism and issues like that. This is something which we think we can perhaps achieve. SDG 16 and issues like that. And we believe that this is something which we can perhaps be able to contribute. The return of cultural property to areas of origin. One of the aid to cultural heritage in times of crisis. And this is a project or a program which we have been working on for some time now, and we feel that it is something which is needed in the world, and we'll continue working on. And again, the issue is culture cannot wait. We cannot say that we just want to save lives and then culture later. Yes, of course, life is important. But then if we just save life and we don't save culture, we try and roll out programs. I think so far we are almost doing 4 to 6 projects a year in order to make sure, of course, in Mali, which finished a week ago. And again, we try to bring people from different parts of the world, not just Africans, but we had people from about this first aid to cultural heritage is trying to make sure that we improve emergency preparedness, particularly in terms of saving components in the civil service preparedness. The police, particularly in Italy and places like that, and we try and design courses which also lead to creating leadership at emergency situations. And it was not people tend to look at conflict again as something. This made ICCROM reflect. ICCROM has said we need to look at how do we prevent fires destroying our heritage. How do we actually make sure that because again, one of the major issues with the Rio fire is that some of the heritage which was in that museum was not even documented because of lack of funds. Over the years, government has taken money out of the museum saying, well, culture can wait, we can do it at another time. The fire came, it destroyed everything before we could record it. So what we are saying is, as ICCROM, we need to prepare museums so that they are ready for these situations. It's not just Brazil. We can look at the number of fires here from London 2013, Moscow, New Delhi, Glasgow, Jakarta, and then the last one there. So it's something which is common, but for some reason we have tended to say, well, it just happened to this museum. And yet, these are supposed to be safe havens, museums, for our cultural heritage. And yet, we are not ready for something which I think preventing fire, if I recall, somebody was telling us, these are the escape doors when we came, right? You will be surprised that most of these museums don't have escape doors. They don't have fire extinguishers, or the fire extinguishers have never been tried or tested or whatever. But again, I think it's something which we need to do something about. The other program which we are putting forward, again, which has got a lot to do with documentation, is this one which links people, nature, and culture in heritage conservation. For some time, we have worked in silos. IUCN on its own, cultural organization, ICOMOS, ICCROM, UNESCO on their own. But I think there's quite a lot of common elements which we need to bring together. And this is one of the flagship programs which we are trying to, or which we are already putting into motion. And the whole idea, again, is to develop effective management, to make sure that we carry out impact assessments to see what are the risks which cultural heritage and natural heritage has, and get prepared in time. I'm not going to go into the programs of ATA as a region. I'm sure Zaki will be able to give you more information on this, but just to say that very much reflecting the programs of ICCROM at every stage, and he will probably do a good job of that. One of our important areas is the provision of knowledge or sharing information, particularly on cultural heritage. And over the years, of course, we have produced a number of books, a number of texts. A lot of them are in on internet. Most of our books now basically are e-books rather than sort of paper books, so that people can have access to that. Zaki has also done a good job in translating some of these books so that they are accessible. I just wanted to mention the ICCROM archive as one of the pillars of our work, particularly if you're going to be doing documentation. It was very interesting when I came across this picture of the Bamiyan Buddha. If you recall, a few years ago it was destroyed, and this picture was taken in 1970. And when I compared it with the pictures which were taken just before the blast, and I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I could see, just by looking at the pictures, how much deterioration had gone on in less than 15 years. And this is something which we should be using our archives to try and see how we monitor things and what has happened. Again, I have that the stupa in Sri Lanka, the same thing. You can clearly see that certain things had deteriorated. It no longer looks like this. Of course, there have been additions and so forth. But making this information available to our member states is one of the key issues which we have to address, because not everyone has access to information which is here. I was also looking at, somebody mentioned Ethiopia, Lalibela and so forth. Some of the photographs which were taken in 1970s, 1960s, and how things have developed ever since and what happened there. I think it's important that we use our archives to try and get correct information, but also try and use our archives for monitoring and for planning purposes. This leads me to another important program for ICCROM, which is the Sounds and Image Conservation program. A lot of our information is digital, and it also needs to be conserved. And we have done a lot at training in the last few years in trying to train people to conserve digital information. It might look like it's yesterday, but unless we conserve it and make it available, we might actually lose it. The other program, which is interesting to note, which again does a lot of documentation, particularly within the museum side, is the REORG program, which again, in the last year, looked at 144 museums in over 30 countries. And the situation in most of the museums is the same. Some artifacts in the storeroom, no documentation. They were collected, and there's bare minimum information on it. We need to be looking at it and saying, how do we actually ensure that it is conserved? Understanding the materials. This is also some of the courses ICCROM does. We look at paper conservation in Mexico and in Japan. I've already mentioned the sound and image. The stone course, which for the first time this year was done in Mexico. Again, trying to make sure that we understand the material which we use for conservation. I think I want to end by saying that given the number of conflicts in not just here, but in the world, I think we need to find a way of how we can use heritage to silence the guns in these areas, because that is the best conservation method we can have. I know it's not easy, but perhaps how do we make sure that heritage is not a target, but it is a force for good to bring communities, to bring countries together. Shukran.
Thank you very much to Dr. Ndoro for this inspiring first speech, and welcome again to colleagues that I see that they have joined us here in the conference. I think one of the main uh, aspects and main objectives that we try to develop throughout the years is to really work in partnership. And I think having partners like EMENA, University of Oxford, Global Heritage Fund, Art Jameel, and many others that we are partnering with is really the way to go for us. And I think one, as we say in Arabic, one hand would not clap, you know. So I think this is really important. Thanks again, Director General, for this introductory speech, because I think what we have started last year in May 2017, we had a meeting with UNESCO in Rome with a document that was issued called the Rome Appeal, in which we were actually focusing on the importance of documentation. And I think this is really important for this particular conference, which I think we can learn from each other throughout the papers that will be presented during the next 2 days. Talking about disaster risk management, we have been doing a lot, and I think the next stage we have addressed professionals, now we are addressing communities in Sudan, but also we will be addressing police and police forces in the coming few months. We are partnering with Interpol, and we will be working more to see how we can protect our cultural heritage with the first front line, if you want, in times of crisis. Also, the Director General mentioned the translation work that we have been doing, and I would like also to thank all my colleagues who have been working hard to make our work visible, and I think many of them are here in the room. So I want to also to thank them for this great work that we have been producing for the center. I just want to stop, I think, to start the session with the first speaker, Mr. Manuel Fiol, who is from UNOSAT, and I think that would be a very important lecture to start such a conference with, because Mr. Fiol will be talking to us how satellite images in particular are crucial to documentation. So I hope that we will be on time to have a discussion towards the end of this session. So Mr. Fiol, you have 20 minutes, and I hope we will manage to be within this time. So please, the floor is yours.
Which one? I don't remember. This one?
Yes.
Okay.
So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Before jumping into the presentation, I want to raise a question, and this is a question that has been in my mind for the past couple of months, as my time with UNOSAT is probably coming to a close, and have been asking myself, are we doing enough to protect cultural heritage? Are we using all available technologies to protect cultural heritage as we speak? And I think the short answer is probably we are not. And I'm hoping that the presentation proves this. So UNOSAT for the past 5 years has been assessing and documenting damage to cultural heritage in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And we do this using satellite images. What you're seeing here is the citadel of Aleppo image in 2010. And this is the citadel at the end of the conflict in 20 February 2017. What we do is very straightforward. It's taking two images and comparing them to identify changes. And those changes, most of the time, mean that there's damage in the area. In the case of the citadel, there were numerous areas that were damage during the conflict. In this particular zoom of the previous image, you're seeing the Great Mosque inside the citadel and the damage that was sustained to the northern wall. And because we understand that satellite images are sometimes difficult to understand, we try to combine them with ground pictures to try to bring a greater understanding of what they're seeing on, people are seeing on satellite images. The other thing that we have done recently, and this is with the help of ICONEM, is to use 3D images to try to explain as well what the damage is and the extent of the damage, the level of the damage. More recently, we tap into the technologies of augmented reality to try to even more bring greater understanding of the damage. This proved very useful when we were working with archaeologists, which were trying to enhance the understanding and the description of the damage. And with the combination of the satellite images, the drone images, and the augmented reality, they were able to understand and describe the damage in great detail. And by the way, in about 2 weeks, UNESCO and UNOSAT are going to publish a detailed assessment on the damage of Aleppo, and it will include several images which are tagged with augmented reality. You can download an app from both the Apple and the Google Store, and you can use your tablet or smartphone to see the different images in augmented reality. The assessment that we did in Aleppo consisted on 5 consecutive yearly assessments, which combined provided a cumulative damage point analysis, and we combined that with data that we received from DGIM in Syria, which was land plot damage assessment. Combining all of those, we were able to identify the exact location of the historical buildings inside the ancient city of Aleppo and assigned a damage level to each one of them. And even more, because it was a 5-year damage assessment, we were able to document the progressive damage to many of these buildings, because sadly, most of the buildings inside the ancient city of Aleppo sustained consecutive damage during those 5 years. This is another view from the methodology that we did. So in the first phase, we did the consecutive damage assessment with 5 different satellite images. And we combined those with different scripts to combine the damage assessment with the land plot analysis. And in the last phase, then we, with the help of archaeologists and historians, we enhanced that point damage assessment with actual descriptions that came from the archaeologists and the historians. But the problem is that regardless of how many reports we do, how many emergency assessments we do when there is an alleged damage to a cultural heritage site, or how many infographics, we are still unable to answer a fundamental question. We don't know how many cultural heritage sites globally are endangered. And the issue is very relevant because every year there are more World Heritage sites being inscribed, and the extent of the heritage sites is still growing even more every year. And the problem is that the support for conservation and protection is diminishing. And just to give you a present-day example of how important it is to document these damages and dangers to cultural heritage sites, I'm going to show you an image that was collected very recently, 25 November. What you're seeing here is Apamea in Syria. And that yellow line is what we suspect is the front line between the Syrian forces and the Free Syrian Army near Apamea. And that white square that you see over there is actually trenches, burns inside Apamea. So Apamea is being used right now as we speak as a battleground. The sad thing is that we came upon this as we were supporting a different, not UNESCO, a different UN organization. So it was purely by chance that we saw this on imagery. So what we're proposing is to develop an automatic damage detection system that will ingest satellite images and identify changes between two satellite images in each one of the known World Heritage Sites, inscribed World Heritage Site. So the first phase of the project will involve creating a heritage library, so we know exactly the extent of each World Heritage Site. The second phase will then start the process of ingesting those two images and doing an algorithm to process the images. The third phase, if damage is detected, if there's a change detected between those two images, it will trigger an alert which will give us an indication that damage was identified and the location of that damage. And the fourth phase, then it will feed that report, that damage report, into a web portal for UNESCO to assess the damage. This is a different view of the process that we're envisioning. So the first phase will be to digitize the World Heritage property boundaries. Then starting the damage detection script, ingesting two satellite images, applying a number of filters, and then through those filters we can identify the possible damage, and then that will feed into reports or the dashboard. So basically the system, what it's doing is applying a number of filters and enhancing the edges and the corners that are visible on that image. And usually damage is very visible when we identify the absence between two images of corners or edges in buildings. And we did recently a pilot program where we selected a number of sites. What we're seeing here is two images for Palmyra. And we were able to run the script and identify the possible damage, in this case, to the Temple of Bel in Palmyra. So we know that the process actually works. That ends the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Lior, to have this presentation done in 10 minutes. That's fantastic. That will allow us for discussion. And I think it's a very good introduction to the work that Emina has been actually involved in the past few years. I'd like now to invite our next speaker from Econem, and I know that Eve could not join us, so now Khalila Hassouna is here to tell us, or maybe show us, much more about their recent work in protecting the past with digital recording techniques. They have been busy in work starting from Aleppo, I remember, and now in many other areas. So, Khalila, please show us your latest work.
Thank you, Zaki. I will take this, the other microphone. So is this working? Yeah. I slightly amended my presentation because UNESCO UNESCO couldn't make it today. I'm the only person who could fly from Paris, apparently, so I'm very proud and pleased with this. Yeah, this one. And I thank you, Akram Athar, for this invitation. Is this working? Yeah. It should be working. Otherwise, I will use the one that's... Okay. I'm not sure it works. Does it work? So, I'm... Sorry about that. Okay, that's it. Yeah. If you can slideshow and start from the beginning. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay. So, I'm head of development for ICONEM. So we are an organization based in Paris, specialized in digital recording for heritage sites, and we focus on endangered heritage. So, so these are the countries where we work. The technique we favor is photogrammetry, which means that we collect large amounts of images, of data, and process them into 3D copies of heritage sites. So we are a very small team of 12 experts, so as I said, based in Paris. We have a team of archaeologists, architects, 3D artists, engineers, and R&D experts. So we operate today in 28 countries. So as you can see, mostly in the Middle East and Asia. We are active in mostly in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And we also have a program in Yemen with support from UNESCO. So the organization has been operating in those countries for, was founded 5 years ago, and in only 5 years we could produce over 250 digital copies of heritage sites. This technology is evolving very fast, and we can now work very quickly, very efficiently in all this on the field. So these are a few organizations we work for. We also work for universities. Obviously, we work for Sorbonne and MIT, among others. And the 3D copies we produce are used by the creative industries in documentaries on TV, or they're used increasingly by tourism organization, and we have a special partnership with UNESCO, which obviously is not exactly a tourism organization, but we do a lot of work for them. And also we produce digital exhibitions. I'm going to show you an example later on. So just a quick word on digital recording, because we are often asked, why should we create 3D copies of heritage sites? We can use, 2D information, photos, to assess the condition of sites. So what's the advantage of working with 3D? So 3D documentation makes damage assessment more precise and more accurate, because you can have a full picture of a monument, and you can see all details down to 1 millimeter in most cases. So it's a very precious tool for damage assessment. So our work in Syria also showed that 3D documentation is crucial to monitor looting activities and destruction. I'm going to show you a few images later on. And what we do a lot also is digital anastylosis. So that's about virtually rebuilding, reconstructing monuments that have been destroyed. And it's a very useful decision-making tool for possible reconstruction. And also, we had a project with the site of Pompeii in Italy, and we found that 3D documentation is very useful just for regular site management, even not in a conflict of crisis. And finally, the 3D models we produce of archaeological sites allow archaeologists to study a site remotely. So this we found with European archaeologists working on Syrian or Iraqi sites can actually, thanks to 3D, continue studying an archaeological site without going to the field. So how do we do this? As you know, there are mainly two different techniques to digitally record a site. So there's photogrammetry and laser grammetry. So maybe you're more familiar with laser grammetry. So an organization like SCI-Arc, for example, uses laser, and we tend to use photogrammetry more. So because in the countries where we work, you need to work very quickly. There are security issues. And we use drones extensively for digital recording. In places like Mosul, for example, we work for UNESCO to record the entire old city, and our team could work only from two main avenues that were more or less free of landmines, and then they send the drones to side streets where it was absolutely unsafe to walk. So it's easier to use drones in such context rather than carrying a laser scanner. So we use a specific kind of drone that I'm going to show you later on that are called long-range drones, and that allows to monitor a site that is absolutely not accessible. So that's something we did, for example, in northern Iraq back in 2015, when the areas were still occupied. Then we sent those long-range drones, and they can fly for about 100 kilometers with the same batteries and record sites under occupation. So the final result is what we call a multi-resolution 3D model. So that means that you can zoom in and have different levels of detail, down to 1 millimeter or up to 5 centimeters for very, very large areas, for example. So obviously this means that we have to manage massive amounts of data to produce 3D, and as I said, technology is evolving very fast on this. And in all our projects, we have a dedicated training program. So everywhere we go, we train local heritage professionals to those 3D documentation techniques. So this is an example of a 3D model. So this, what you saw just before, this is a Greek island called Delos. So we scan the whole island with drones again, and then we also scan specific areas on the ground to get more detail, because drones alone don't give enough detail for 3D documentation. So we tend to mix terrestrial and aerial data capture. So this specific project we did for archaeologists, and they use this on a daily basis when they're not on site to check measurements and to study the site remotely, as I said. So on the right-hand side, you see a few of the functionalities. So we have a lot more now. This is a project that dates back to 2016. But basically what archaeologists or architects can do, they can make measurements, they can make sections, they can zoom in. So in that area, the accuracy is 1 millimeter. And then when we zoom out and you look at the whole island, it goes down to 5-7 centimeter, because obviously you don't need such a high level of detail. So we did similar work on another island in Sudan called Sai, S-A-I, for French archaeologists as well. So this is really photogrammetry, aerial photogrammetry really allows to cover very, very large areas. For the Mosul project, it's about 4 square kilometers that we surveyed this way. And similarly, we produce a 3D cartography for UNESCO. I thought they would present that project before. But I'm going to show you just a picture later on. So you get a full 3D cartography of the old city of Mosul, and you can really have a very, very, very precise damage assessment analysis with details of each wall, basically. So this is the kind of tool that archaeologists and architects use in terms of 3D documentation. And this particular project was produced in partnership with École Française d'Athènes, which is a school of archaeology in Greece. And so we have about, as I said, 250 similar 3D models for sites as varied as city centers, in the context of crisis, so we mentioned Aleppo, Mosul, and also smaller monuments. Oops. Sorry about that. So this is also. So then another technique we use to digitally reconstruct monuments that have been severely damaged. So this is an example, taken from Syria, the Crac des Chevaliers, the castle in Syria. So we collect images. Oops. Sorry. We collect images. Basically, what we do is we collect large amounts of images from the internet, from tourist photos, because this monument before the conflict in Syria was popular with tourists. And we trained Syrian archaeologists to 3D documentation, and that's what we managed to produce. That was back in 2013, 2014, because we've been working with Syria for a long time. And then they collected all the images, we processed them in Paris, and managed to produce a partial 3D model of this castle. And what we could do then after this is compare the conflict before the condition before the conflict and after on the right-hand side. So we could really locate damage and analyze. So, and the 3D rendering on the left-hand side is based on tourist photos, as I said. And a few years later, in 2017, we had an opportunity to get funding from UNESCO to have a complete study of this monument, and this is the 3D rendering, the 3D result of this work for the exterior parts and the inner part. And this work is being shown in Paris in an exhibition on this specific monument, Crac des Chevaliers. Okay. So this is the long-range drone I was talking about earlier. We call it a plane drone. So this is a specific device that we use to monitor sites that are completely inaccessible. And this is taken from a video shot in 2015 in a place that was then the front line between in northern Iraq. So we sent this kind of drones over the sites. In that case, it was Khorsabad. So this 3D rendering dates back to 2015. And we had those images analyzed by archaeologists at Sorbonne University, and all the red dots you see are tunnels dug by looters on the site. And so they counted at least, I think, 60 only in that area, 60 tunnels dug by looters. So while the site was still occupied, we could have some information on what was going on there. So talking about digital anastylosis, again, this is a process we are developing also in Angkor. This is Palmyra in Syria, the Arch of Palmyra, but we also developed this in Angkor in Cambodia. So the idea is to scan the stone blocks that are on the ground and try and reposition them where they were before the monument collapsed. So all these red parts you see are now collapsed. There was an explosion that destroyed this, and then we try to put back every stone block to its initial position. So this is an R&D approach, so it doesn't work every time, but it does help archaeologists and architects to analyze damaged monuments. In April 2016, we sent a team to Palmyra in Syria. It was the first foreign team on site after the liberation of the site, the first liberation. And this is a 3D rendering of the museum of Palmyra, the site museum as it was at the time. So there were hundreds of sculptures that were very, very much damaged, and it was important to get a precise idea of what the museum looked like before it was cleaned. The Syrian archaeologists brought back everything that they found back to Damascus, and they cleaned everything. But it was important to get this idea of what the museum was like just a few days after the liberation. And this is a 3D rendering of the museum. So now we're in Libya, so that's one of our most recent projects. We sent a small team to Libya last spring. So this is the archaeological site of Leptis Magna on the seaside. It's listed on the World Heritage List. And we sent a team to first train local archaeologists, as we do everywhere, and collect images of the sites. It's and to analyze the impact of this situation on this specific archaeological site. So we found that the site was in very good condition, and that the main threat currently, hopefully, is environmental, because there are blocks going down to the sea. There's a lot of erosion. And but we found that the site was in very good condition. So this is the Arch of Septimus Severus, which is the highlight of the site of Leptis Magna. And this is the team of archaeologists we trained. So basically what we do is it's a lot about practical training. A 3D documentation is not something you can really learn in a classroom. It's where we have a theoretical session at the beginning, and then we take them to the archaeological sites, and they help capture data. They're trained to use drones in some cases. So you can see on the right-hand side, this is a tablet for to use. So it's a kind of hands-on training. It's very important to be on the site. So this is an extract from a video we produced. Was the technical partner. We collected all images on site. We sent a team first in February, and had changed dramatically because people are going back, which is good, but there is still a lot of explosion, Changri Mosque, because it's a flagship project of UNESCO. And perhaps, sorry, I can show you on. I will show you a short video on or maybe if I have just a few minutes, President is currently in Angkor to present this work, so, and I'm not sure it works. Perhaps if I can show some. 1 minute, so I show something else then.
Yeah.
We put together, so see these red dots are all the images that are collected. So a big exhibition we produced in Paris. Oops. Showing, give you my details if you're interested to be in touch. If I find it. Yeah. Okay. So don't hesitate if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Khalila Hassouna, the head of development of Econem, on giving us latest information on the work you have been doing. Hamid Reza Jaihani from University of Kashan, who will be now talking the Fin area in Kashan, Iran. So you're welcome, Mr. Jaihani, and I hope now we could start seeing, some of the
I'm willing to talk about a model of settlement in Persian Plateau and also its aspects and challenges. It has always been hard to define the buffer zone and determine the core zone for some historic sites associated with historic gardens. One problem is related to the common misunderstanding and the limitation of the garden into an enclosed. Threatening factors are misunderstood. For a better view, I should refer to Fin Kuchak area, which is near Kashan. Semi-mythological dynasty in Iran. The region is connected with some sites and from Paleolithic to Islamic period. It seems that the region for Aftarkhun area, for example, in this area, related to Qanats. When we scroll through the area, we find sets of agricultural related habitats that are linked to the Qanats. The accuracy in the elements forming this field, Zarobis, outline in Mir'at al-Qasan, mentioning that these habitats have played a major role in the economy of the. We must first look at another example called Farabad Garden and Farm in Bordeaux, visible here. But the more important example that I'm considering is Fin Garden and its area. Beyond the functions, the general pattern of landscape, its elements are mountain or highland, spring and qanats, mazharkhane or a place of entry and appearance of water in the garden, royal gardens, square and avenue, and of course a set. This ancient habitat complex, which is complemented with other elements such as flood walls and numerous water mills, is not accidental, at least on the scale of. Therefore, it was not just a response to a situation in Kashan. For example, we can see the repetition of the Finns pattern in the area around the Shazda Garden in Kerman, Dolatabad through Qanats. In addition, the mentioned area that have a similar pattern to Fin includes elements such as mountain or higher lands, infertile plain use, and historical roads and squares. It is also a model that can be identified among various systems of settlement in Iran. This system, which reveals the spirit and meaning of the garden on before. Therefore, its protection is vital. And of course, it should be clear that to what extent these challenges and threats will affect the mentioned settlement system. There are small or large samples of a habitat. Thus, according to Charter, the Conservation of Historic Towns and Urban Areas, Washington, 1987, it is possible to recognize their character and characteristics shaped by minor pattern, whether urban or rural, the macro pattern or the manner of relationship between the area and the environment, the texture and physical aspect of the sub-areas. Now let's take a closer look at Fin. The shape of the region is recognizable in its original status. On photograph shows the Fin's outskirt, which is a royal agriculture habitat, representation of the elements and components of the proposed landscape, which is based on the EMENAT databases, which are based on the water of Suleiman Spring or Tambali Kanat. Along with these important gardens, of changes, the massive changes that began with the construction of the highway affected. This is Amir Kabir Street. Instead of a historical access to the area. Apart from the damage to the aforementioned road, the possibility of continuing it to the unpublished planning to the path on the other side of the highway can expand the scope of China. The mere housing can distort the region's border and its shape and pattern. The construction of a stadium on the highlands overlooking the garden has affected the mountain landscape or mountain landscape and the logic of settlement too. All of this damage have undermined parts of the value of the region, but the main challenge is the change of land use in the fields around the area, because it will completely destroy the layout and fabric of settlement system, undermine its authenticity, and seriously damage its integrity. The mentioned damages in Fin and also visible in other cases, for example, crossing the highway from the territory of Shazde Garden, where the remains of the historic avenue have been cut off by the construction of a new highway in this area. Or around the Garden of Dolatabad, that the development of housing in farmland and Dove to the garden has changed the face of region and has destroyed the historical elements like the historical path. Also in Tabas, where the construction has destroyed gardens' natural environments. Here is the old garden. Compare it with the from 40 years ago. Or natural environment, and has changed the concept of the garden as the first livable point. In this case, according to the main feature of the desired area, which is its span more than anything else, we have to pay attention to the integrity and the necessity of preserving it. Because without deep attention to the integrity and constituents of the areas mentioned above, the concept of an environmental pattern will be reduced to one and only a settlement, while the repetition of this pattern indicates the importance and efficiency and its antiquity. Integrity has been addressed in Article 14 in the Charter of Venice. However, emphasis was on the area of a monument as required by the time of editing and adopting the Charter. In recommendation concerning the safeguarding and contemporary role of historic areas, 1976, it was mentioned about preserving the integrity between rural communities and their natural setting. In addition, in the Declaration of San Antonio, 1996, as an interpretation of NARA document on authenticity, 1994, where proofs of authenticity were considered, and along with the reflection of true value, context, identity, and use and function, integrity is also mentioned. Therefore, the importance of integrity in preserving authenticity is also evident. In this case, the declaration asks, is the site fragmented? How much is missing, and what are the recent additions? A solution to prevent these challenges and threats is the development of preventive protection through defining a system of buffer zones, which is often difficult to justify and does not get much support and is considered as an obstacle to the development of the region. However, recognizing all the works related to the region and emphasizing their different values and the role they play in the settlement system may help for a better and more accurate understanding of the values of the region and provide a new justification for preventive conservation programs. In addition, the extent and distribution of habitats elements and components make it necessary to pay attention to a system for pathology and sites permanent monitoring. In this system, it is essential to be able to record and characteristics and the status of each element or area and provide the context for finding related elements or unknown features. This is what the IMENA program can do. Additionally, outputs of this program, such as integrated maps and related information, allow lowest destructive interventions. From this perspective, at least, for the areas discussed here, IMENA can help by the representation of an elements and related complications and the relation between them, both to preserve the internal integrity of the habitats between the elements, its elements, and to preserve its integrity with other important elements around the mentioned pattern or external integrity. Thank you very much.
Stay here. You were sitting here. Thank you very much, Mr. Jayhani, Professor Jayhani, for this interesting presentation about the site of Fenn in Kashan in Iran. I'd like to request the speakers, Khalila and Manuel, if you could join us here on the podium for a discussion. We have about exactly 15 minutes for discussions and questions for those who would like to ask questions or discuss certain aspects presented by the speakers. Do we have the, yeah. Okay, so I think this session was a good introduction after the presentation of the Director General of ICRAM. So I think would like to open the floor for those who have comments, questions, or, yeah, we have Dr. Iman Asi from...
Yes. Thanks a lot. I have two comments or questions for Khalila and Mr. Fadl. Yes. For your presentation, it was really very nice to use this documentation for World Heritage Site. And I don't know how can this be really effective tool for monitoring for World Heritage Sites? Did you contact World Heritage Center to be really as periodic reporting, monitoring? I mean, how can you work with World Heritage? This is really very important. Because
this is the first question, I believe. I think you have another question.
The next
for Khalila,
question for Khalila. I mean, you have shown a lot of documentation in really a conflict zone. And to do a documentation, I think it will really take a lot of fund. I mean, you have first to find some funding agencies. But I mean, I remember in Palestine when we did the damage assessment in 2003, I mean, it takes like 2 months to do it, and like 200 people, students and architects to do it. And we did it by our own. Suppose that you want to do something in, in an area which doesn't have a fund. What do you do? I mean, you should think of these areas. I mean, the unprivileged
areas. They don't have
areas.
funding.
Yes.
How do you work in areas with no funds? Okay, we'll start with Manuel, I think.
So to clarify, everything that we have done so far in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, most of that data is available either in our websites or or in the IMINA website. In the IMINA website, you will be able to find in a couple of weeks, once the report is published, the detailed analysis for the ancient city of Aleppo. And then hopefully next year, middle of the year or at the end of the year, we're going to publish a full report on Syria, and that data is going to be available as well on the IMINA website. For the what I just presented, what we have done so far is only a pilot program with the help of CERN. CERN is the European Center for Physics Nuclear Research, and Google Inc. To see the feasibility of doing this monthly assessment on every culture, World Heritage Site around the world. So we know that the system works. What we're looking for now is for funding to actually implement the project.
Thank you, Manuel. Khalila?
Yes, thank you for your question. Just to complement what Manuel just said, I mentioned Pompeii. Pompeii is a very, very large archaeological site in Italy. It's very difficult to monitor, to actually know what's going on the site, because it's about 12 square kilometers. And we, back in 2013, we did the first large-scale scan of Pompeii in 3D. And the site managers were really interested in using this for regular monitoring. And at the time, it was a bit more expensive than it is today. And in 2003, I can imagine it was very time-consuming, very expensive. Now, just to give you a practical example, we can record a World Heritage Site of average size in 2 to 3 days. And we have teams on the field of two people, one with drone, one on the ground. So it's with very light equipment, cameras and small drones. And then, of course, you need time for processing all these images. We have projects with up to 150,000 images to be processed with specific 3D softwares. So, but the cost has gone down a lot. And I shouldn't say that, but we can afford to work in places where there is no funding. We do it occasionally. But just to give you an idea, to record and process all images for heritage site of average size, it's $25,000, all included, emission costs included. So it's gone down a lot because you can work so quickly on the field, and then processing has improved as well. So you can have a very, very good project. For example, the island, actually, the Greek island, it was around that price, 25,000. So just for a whole island. So people tend to imagine that it's a lot more expensive than it is, and it's very quick as well. So occasionally we work in places where there is absolutely no funding. But for Libya, for example, we had a corporate sponsor. So you always find ways to cover the cost.
Thank you very much, Khalila. I think the costs are going down every year. I remember few years ago, everything was really costly to use 3D laser scanning, or now things are more affordable. More questions? Comments? Okay, Rand Epic.
Sorry to dwell on costs again, but a question for UNOSAT. Really fantastic presentation. I can see how... Oh, okay. Thank you. A question for you, because really a fantastic presentation. I can see how it would be very helpful to monitor these sites all over the world. But again, the cost. I mean, you have agreements with these satellite companies. I mean, it seems like they could make a special deal for us, no, in Heritage, because I know they're very expensive, the satellite images.
Yeah. The one reason why we think the project is actually feasible is because we have an agreement with Digital Globe and the U.S. government that they provide the imagery for free. Oh, so that's, but then
over time, they have it over time. They give it to you over time.
Yeah, we have access to the full image library from Digital Globe. The problem is that then to actually implement the program, we need funding. We were able to fund the pilot program to actually do the testing and see if it was actually feasible to do it. But the implementation is difficult because of lack of funding, yeah.
And it's just from their library, or will they task a satellite for you?
Sorry?
It's just from their library of
I-
pre-captured images, or
Good-
will they task a satellite for you?
Good question. It's only for archive imagery, yeah, no tasking. But Digital Globe usually in areas where World Heritage Site is damaged, they collect very frequently. So we don't think it's going to be an issue.
Great, thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Rand, for the question. We have more questions now. I have Miss Titi, I think, and Bob.
شكرا أول إشي شكرا على العرض التقديمي. في عندي سؤال كوني من في عندي سؤال كوني من منطقة نزاع من خلال استخدام البرامج في كثير مواقع كنا نجد صعوبة من الصور الجوية إن نكشف عنها أو نشوفها. في آلية مستقبلا إنه هاي الصور يتم إنه نستطيع أن نشوف شو موجود في هذا الموقع ما يكون عندنا مشفر بشكل كامل.
ما يكون شو؟
مشفرة ما الصورة بتكون مشفرة ما ببين فيها أي شيء يعني.
The question of Miss Titi is related to the fact that they are on the ground. They have some difficulty accessing the satellite images. Sometimes these images are not accessible, so they have certain code to access. So is there any way that we could overcome this problem in the future? I think the question is for you, Emmanuel.
The problem with satellite images is that they are licensed. So with the current agreement that we have with the U.S. government and Digital Globe, we can provide images for free to UN organizations and to NGOs. Apart from that, sometimes we have been able to provide imagery, but with special permission.
Bob?
Thank you, and thank you all for the presentations. My question is something that we often think about in the Endangered Archaeology Project, which is I'd like your comments on whether there's the infrastructure to be able to receive the data that you've created. And it's similar to the question that's just been asked, because it's one thing for the information to be available on our computers and our laptops, but is the infrastructure there in all the places that you've worked? And I'm thinking also about Econom, so that the data created can be used by the people who need to use it.
I think in the case of UNOSAT, we have a unique opportunity, and is that the fact that UNOSAT is a place at CERN. So we have access to CERN's IT infrastructure, which in Europe and I think worldwide is unique because it's definitely cutting edge. So we have access to the full IT infrastructure, including server space, internet, privileged internet access. For example, we can download satellite images in a matter of seconds. And usually if you download a satellite images from home, it's going to take you hours, if not days, just to give you an example.
Thank you, Manuel. You want to say something else, Bob? Oh.
Yeah, you're totally right. It's important when we train local archaeological services. For example, we train the State Board of Antiquities in Iraq, and we totally adjust it to the kind of equipment they have. They know there's no point in getting training for equipment that you don't have on the ground in the long term. So, and we created a dedicated viewer, 3D viewer for the State Board of Antiquities, taking account of, well, a lot of people didn't even have laptops, they work with their smartphones a lot. So, and the good thing is you can now view 3D on a smartphone. So we make the most of what technology offers today.
Thank you, Khalila. I see there are two more questions from this side, France Desmarais and then George Richards. Do we have any more questions that I haven't seen? And there's a lady over there. So let's start with France. For the translation, please, yes.
Thanks. Thank you, Zaki. First Congratulations. I'm happy to see the progress that this field has made. I sometimes think I may have planted the idea of satellite imagery monitoring for cultural heritage to previous leadership at UNOSAT 7 years ago. So I'm really happy this has been picked up and is being generalized. I would have one comment and one question. Now that it is being generalized, do you have a strategy to make sure that there's no duplication or overlap? Because when you are monitoring a site or a country, how do we make sure that another organization with very little resources is not also trying to do the same while they could be using those funds or those efforts or resources? We know that we're in a field that has very little resources, and we need to make sure we try to avoid duplication and we try to work together as much. So this would be my question, and my comment would really be, I'm glad my colleague raised this question about access to images. I think ethically we should not be monitoring sites of countries and not giving them access to those images. I'm uncomfortable with the fact that international organizations such as mine and NGOs such as the one I used to work at would have access to those images while the main people concerned would not. Ethically, I think it's something we really need to take into consideration.
Okay, so maybe you have to answer this question first, and then we move to the next question.
Regarding the use of access of imagery, sadly these are commercial vendors and they have limitations to the uses of imagery. And the current agreement only allows us to share the imagery with the UN and NGOs organizations. But just to give you an indication, on most occasions when we do ask for special access of imagery for, let's say, countries, we recently received a request from Afghanistan to access imagery, and the access was granted, and we gave them over 100 images for different cultural heritage sites. So the access is there. It's just a matter of that we have to go through the process of requesting it. Yeah.
Thank you, Manuel. Another time. Now, Richard, George.
Thank you. A related question to some of the others that have been asked just now regarding the data itself. And apart from the access to the imagery, as Franz was just asking, a question that we've been thinking about at Al-Jamil is how can we make sure that as well as training local communities in the techniques for documenting cultural heritage, and Econem, I know you've done some great work in this, how can we then train local communities also in the data processing side and the management of the data, so that not only having access to those to that data, but also potentially locating this data physically, the servers in the region, not having it outside, and making sure that people in this part of the world, if it's sites in this part of the world, have the skills necessary to be able to manage and organize, archive that data themselves, rather than that whole side of the work being left outside of the region. Because I think what often happens is that there's a big focus on training people in photogrammetry, etc., and then the next stage is almost kept opaque and closed box to people from this part of the world. So I think that's something that as a group here we need to also be thinking of. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very good question, George. I think, I don't know which speaker would like to answer this. It's a general question. Who wants to start?
Very quickly, you're perfectly right, and data processing is key. And what the problem obviously is computing power in those countries is very difficult to process large data sets. So what we do is we train. We always have a session on data processing, but for objects or for architectural details, because that's the maximum that computers in those countries can take. Unfortunately, when we train archaeologists in Afghanistan, it's without internet connection. So so data processing, unfortunately, for large data sets is still made remotely in Europe.
Thank you very much. I think, do you want to add anything? Nothing? All right. Okay. Well, There was another question over there. Yes.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أشكر كل القائمين على هذا المؤتمر، فيه معلومات مهمة. أنا ما عندي ولا سؤال، وأذكركم في مقولة أبونا الشيخ زايد: ما له ماضي ما له حاضر. شكرا.
Shukran. That was just a comment that thanking everybody for this important conference, and also quoting Sheikh Zayed, and this is the year of Sheikh Zayed, who stated once that those who don't have the past, they don't have the present. Thank you very much for this comment, and maybe with this comment we end this first session. I'd like to have you all join me to thank the speakers for this first session, Manuel, Khalila, and Hamid Reza. Please join me to thank them. And we will be coming back here after lunch at exactly 2 o'clock. So have a good lunch.